All right, let's open our Bibles tonight to Genesis chapter 18 as we continue our study through that book of beginnings, the book of Genesis. I want to do like a 5 or 10 minute overview just because we're in kind of the second section. It'll probably be the last night that I'm able to do that, and we'll just kind of start wherever we start from here on out. But in chapter 12, this book takes a completely different turn. The first 11 chapters cover 2,000 years of history. They're all the beginnings of many things. And they cover all of the major events in history, if you will. And those are chapters 1 through 11. But once we get to chapter 12 and we go forward, we cover less than 400 years between chapter 12 and the end of the book. And God focuses, rather than the big picture, upon four men who take the story of God's work forward to develop a people and a nation of his choosing, and through whom he would eventually send his son, Jesus the Messiah, forth. So God begins with Abraham, the father of the Jewish people, also the father of those who would believe in the Lord. We then will move on to Isaac, and it won't be too long from now. Then his son Jacob, who will have 12 sons who will become the tribes of Israel, and God will particularly focus on one of them, Joseph. But they are extremely important for us because it is in that history that Jesus is pointed out to us again and again. These first years of the Jewish development are usually called the days of the patriarch. They are the kind of the humble beginnings of a nation that God had chosen and made promises to. In chapter 12, Abram was living in a very idolatrous society, Ur of the Chaldees. God had promised him a land and a descendancy and a work, and how he would bless those that would bless him. And though Abraham was from an idolatrous family, he heard the voice of God, but he didn't immediately follow the voice of God. And so when his dad wanted to move kind of out of the area, but he still kind of stayed in that zone, if you will, and he moved to the edge of the wilderness, but not further, and he took his wife and his little nephew with him, his brother's son. His brother had died. And he stayed in Haran until his dad died. And Abraham at that time was 75 years old. At 75, though, God had spoken to him years earlier. He moved again by faith, believing God, not knowing where he went. We are told in Hebrews 11, verse 8. And he headed for the land of promise with his wife and his nephew in tow, as God had called him. He showed up in a place called Shechem, where he built an altar of worship, and God, in response, reiterated his promise to Abram of a land and of a descendancy there in chapter 12. He built another place of worship at Bethel. And then a famine hit the land that he had just recently arrived at, and our man of faith ran to Egypt to find relief from a famine in the land, chapter 12. He lied about his wife. He stumbled in his newly found faith. The Pharaoh of Egypt, a wicked man, rebuked him for his deceptiveness, but God protected his own, and though he was weak, God was certainly with him. Eventually, he then returned to the land repentantly. Abraham returned to the altars that he had built, and worship began again, but he brought back Hagar, a slave, if you will, a servant from Egypt. Lot brought back a taste for the Egyptian way of life, always a type of the world. And so, that straying didn't come without consequence. He was able to bring back, if you will, from his straying some things that weren't very helpful to him in the years that would follow. But back in chapter 13, or I should say in chapter 13, Abraham is back in fellowship with the Lord. We are told of the strife between his servants and that of Lot's. Both of them had become wealthy. They had brought a lot with them, but they had gained a lot, it would appear, in Egypt as well. Abram wanted to have peace with his family member. He even said, the Canaanites are watching us. But in order to do that, Lot was, determined to get what he thought he wanted. And so Abram said, just take what you want. I'll go in the other direction. You take whatever you want, and I'll take what's left. And Lot, going by sight, picked out the plains of Jordan. Looked like the Garden of Eden is what he said first, and then he said, and also looked like the land of Egypt, I think is how he determined. It looks good to me. And he looked at it, he moved closer to it. Eventually he would move into Sodom, And by the last time we see him almost, he's a ruler in town. And not good. After Lot departed, God reappeared to Abram. He assured him he had lost nothing in the process, that though he had been given, if you will, a barren desert, one day it would all belong to his descendants as far as the eye could see in every direction. And we talked about how Lot picked by sight, but God had picked for Abram. Always better to let God choose for you than you for yourself. In chapter 14, Abram goes on a very heroic rescue operation. He finds himself in the midst of a civil war. There were 4 kings in the north. They were descendants of Ham. They formed a coalition and began to tax the 5 kings in the south. For 12 years, they paid, and then they decided, we're going to fight back. We're not going to do this anymore. As a result, those 4 kings of the north came with their armies, decimated the towns and the cities in the south, including Sodom, and they took, of all things, Lot along with everything else. And Abram just couldn't stand by and let that happen. And so with an unprecedented kind of courageous move, asking the Lord for help, he took 318 of his own servants, and he went after these guys and traveled for mile after mile, chasing them to the north, finally confronting them, overthrowing them, and bringing back all of the spoils, both people and especially for him, Lot. Returning from the battle, he meets an unusual king. We will see him in a couple of places in the Bible. He's called the king of Salem, sometimes called Melchizedek. It's this mysterious monarch. His name means the king of righteousness. Abraham pays him tithes, worships him, gives him of the spoil, if you will, and then Melchizedek turns around and gives to Abram wine and bread. Interesting pictures. At the very least, Melchizedek is a type of Jesus. Others believe, and most people do, I believe that it was probably a theophany, a pre-existent incarnate appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament, if you will. And he is recorded, like I said, several times in the Old Testament. I'll leave it up to you whether that's comfortable for you or not. It doesn't really matter, but that's my personal conviction. When he got done meeting with the king of Salem, he was also met by the king of Sodom. In chapter 14, verse 2, I think his name was Bera. We'll call him the king of rottenness, since we have a king of righteousness. Corrupt guy. He offered Abram money. He said, I just want the people back. You can have all the loot. And Abram said, the Lord makes me rich, no one else. I want nothing from you. Just pay the guys who went with me their food and whatever. In chapter 15, God appears to Abraham 9 years after he had left Ur of the Chaldees. He is now 84 years old. God again assures to Abraham of his protection and of his progeny. You'll have your own child from your own body. Verse 6 of chapter 15 is one of those important verses. It says that Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. And it really does establish in the Bible this relationship that you can have by faith alone. That's what God's interested in. Not your accomplishments, but your trust. Believing him, that's what God looks for from you. And then whatever that obviously generates in your heart and in your life. In chapter 16, 2 years have passed. Abram is now 86 years old. His wife is 76. And she and he hatch a scheme to help God out. After all, the Lord said it will be through Abram's body. He didn't say anything about Sarah as far as they knew. And so she, proposes to Abram to marry this woman that they had brought back from Egypt, Hagar. She was younger and of childbearing age. And Abram was convinced that, okay, maybe that's what the Lord wants to do. And so they, in their anxiety and inability to wait upon the Lord, and again, our hero of faith is not necessarily always so faithful. He runs ahead. He helps the Lord to his own hurt, as if somehow God is unable to do what he says. I'm going to just help the Lord out. And so Ishmael is born. You know the story if you were with us. Between chapters 16 and 17, 13 years pass. And both Abram and Sarah come to the point where they would now learn that God is almighty, and we meet the name of the Lord El Shaddai in that chapter. God is able to do what he has promised. Both Abram and Sarai's names are changed to reflect the promise of God about a descendants. There's a covenant of circumcision established to say to them, look, life in the spirit, not in the flesh, is what we are looking for. Abram is 99. His wife is 89 years old. You'll have a son, Abram. It'll be from your body, and Sarah will bear this child. And what a promise. God is able. So in chapter 12, there's his calling. In chapter 12, there's also his carnality. He waits for a while to move. In chapter 13, there's a commitment and a conviction in his heart. There's courage and communion in chapter 14. There's a covenant with God in chapter 15, his compromise with his wife in chapter 16, and then circumcision and a covenant made with God again in chapter 16 and 17. As the Lord said, within a year from now, you're going to have a son. You can name him Laughter. His name will be Isaac. And through him, your seed will be blessed, and the land will be realized down the road. In chapter 18, which we are tonight, and in chapter 19, which we intend, Lord be willing, to go over next week, God puts together the consequences of the choices made by both Abram and Lot. And they're kind of defined very clearly in these two chapters. Abraham and Lot, were promised the ongoing blessings of God. And you will find that Abraham, with all of his difficulty, with all of the weakness, with all of the striving and the stumbling, still finds God's best. And as he grows, God continues to bless him. And then there are these constant losses found in Lot's life, who had chosen to settle in Sodom with his family. And now, like I said, we'll find him being a judge in the city, and he'll lose even his very family in many ways. So Abram made some good choices, even though he's growing up and struggling like the rest of us do. He's heading in the right direction. God is patient with his son. Lot, it seems, goes in every wrong direction that's possible. And were it not for one verse in 2 Peter, I wouldn't have believed Lot would have made it to heaven. But I'm sure that he did. But I can't explain to you why. I just know that God is gracious, and he knows more than we do, and certainly more than was written in what we are told and can understand. But these two chapters give us the consequences of the contrasting life choices, if you will. There's that Psalm 1 where it says, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, that does not stand in the path of sinners, does not sit in the seat of the scornful. But his delight rather is in the law of the Lord, and his law he meditates day and night. He's like a tree that has been planted by the rivers of water that brings forth its fruit in its season. Its leaf doesn't wither. Whatever he does prospers. It really is the contrast between the two men, if you will. Blessing and gain for Abram, covenants and land to come and descendancy, and a child in his old age. Even this weak, faltering man who God began to work in continued to find God's best as he pushed forward. C.S. Lewis once wrote, if you put first things first, then second things will be thrown in. But if you seek second things first, you will gain neither the first nor the second. Jesus put it this way in Matthew chapter 8, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added to you. But the problem for us, and you can make the comparison in these two chapters between Lot and Abram, or Abraham now, the problem begins when we set out to seek after what God has promised us to add to us if we seek him first. But if we seek everything that he promises but don't seek him first, that's kind of what Lot did. And we hope that God will throw in the kingdom while we're pursuing these secondary things, and he will not. So Abram, however, has been trusting the Lord, and we will find him so blessed in chapter 18 as we start with a very unusual story given to us by the Lord of two others coming in the form of men with the Lord to speak to Abram in person, and then leaving some unsettling news with him, but yet revealing his very merciful heart. So tonight in chapter 18, and see, we made it. It'll be our last review. Abraham gets to meet with God face to face. Verse 1. Then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. Then the Lord, and the word there is the word Yahweh. Remember, all capital letters when the word Lord is always the translation of the name Yahweh. The name Yahweh is the name that God uses for himself when he wants to tell you he does what he says. He's a covenant God. And he also uses it to always say to us, I can become whatever you need if you'll just look to me. So whenever you see these L-O-R-D in capitals, that's always God's expression of who he is in terms of he becomes all that we need and he does what he promises. So the Lord appears to Abram as he sat wisely in the shadow of a terebinth. All we can gather from at least the Bible is that a terebinth tree is kind of like a pistachio tree. It is mentioned as a common tree in the Bible more than once. And Abram, he's smart. He's gotten out of the sun, sitting in the heat of the day in his tent door. When disguised as some travelers or Bedouins, the word Bedouin means a desert dweller. These three, I should say, stopped by Abraham's tent on their way to Sodom. In so doing, as we continue to read, God reveals to himself, to Abraham, as his friend, a wonderful title that is given, by the way, only to Abraham in the scriptures, and it's given to him 3 times. When in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, Jehoshaphat is leading the nation of Judah in prayer as they face war. He says to them, are you not our God who drove out the inhabitants of the land before us, your people Israel, and you gave it to the descendants of Abraham, your friend, forever? In Isaiah chapter 41, as God speaks through the prophet, he personally calls Abraham his friend. The verse reads like this, but you, Israel, are my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the descendants of Abraham, my friend. And again, James picks that up in chapter 2 when he writes, in the scriptures which we fulfilled, that Abraham believed God, it was counted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. So later on in Abraham's life, now we're moving forward in his life, 99 years old. He'll live to be 175, so I guess middle age, if you will. Abraham gets a visit from his friend, and in this encounter, we're given kind of, and I want to point out to you 4 qualities of having friendship with God that we might want to take notice of. Verse 2 says that Abraham lifted up his eyes, and he looked, and behold, there were 3 men standing by him, and when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and he bowed himself to the ground. First point of being a friend of God. God likes to make unexpected visits. It is at a time in the middle of the day, in the heat of it, when no one is traveling, when no one is even taking a chance to walk through the desert, during the afternoon siesta, that these 3 strangers appear on the horizon headed for Abram's tent. He was certainly not expecting visitors at this time. You want to be a friend of the Lord? Then you be open to his timetable rather than your own. And I must tell you, it is one of the hardest things to just adjust your schedule to his. You know, I was talking to somebody the other day, and I said, you know, we pray every day, Lord, take care of my life today. And then we spend the whole day complaining about how he's doing. Oh, I got a flat, I missed the bus, I couldn't get this, and this didn't work out. Oh my goodness, I got a boss who's crazy. You know, Lord, take care of my day, and then yeah, for the whole day. Well, that's not how a friend works. Friendship with God demands we be open to his plans. He may have plans that mess up your plans. But that's how a friend works, right? Here the Lord arrives without notice. It's unscheduled. It's too late to clean up the tent, put on a new t-shirt. The Lord and 2 others we believe to be angels. In fact, we believe this is another theophany or a Christophany of an appearance of Jesus and 2 angels. Why do we say that? Well, in chapter 18, verse 16, it says 2 men went forward, but in chapter 19, verse 1, it said 2 angels arrived. So if you keep reading, God oftentimes just gives us what we need to know. But look, only good friends can come over without a phone call. You probably have a good friend that you wouldn't mind if they just dropped by. And there's other people that you're all right with, but you don't want them to come over without calling. And then there are still others that you turn off the lights and pretend you're not home. But you know how that works. But only good friends can move you to accommodate them without complaint. Even change your schedule to meet theirs. That was Abraham and the Lord. He receives a visit from his friend. He suddenly realizes this is more than just a visit, right? Or more just ordinary men. He went, he fell on his face, he showed them tremendous respect, and his insight was correct. Secondly, if you want to be God's friend, you better be humble. Not only should you be open to his unexpected plans, but to be God's friends, you have to be humble. Notice here that Abraham bowed himself to the ground, and it is the word that is often used for homage or the word for worship. Abraham did more than greet these folks in a very Eastern style. He realized who he was before. Now, understand, Abraham is 99 years old. He has tremendous wealth. He has at least 318 servants just in his own house. He is well liked by the people of the land, as we're going to read here down the road. Abraham is a humble guy, and though he might have been a powerful figure in his world, before the Lord, he is on his face. I once heard a story I liked very much, and I think maybe Skip Heitzig toward it. I'll give him credit. He can take it if he likes. But he told the story of a minister who had survived the great Johnstown flood back in the 1880s in Pennsylvania. 2,000 people or so had died, but he had survived it. And after this had kind of cleared itself, every place he go, he'd talk about how he survived. And then I prayed, and the Lord, and I survived, And eventually everyone in town had heard it, and they were kind of tired of hearing it. But, he liked telling it. So he dies, and he goes to heaven, and in heaven, Peter says to the saints, "Come on, let's gather together. It's testimony time." And the minister raised his hand and said, "I'd like to talk about surviving the Johnstown flood." And Peter said, "Okay, you can talk, but I just want you to know Noah is here." And he kind of put him in his spot. Abraham, as powerful as he was, knew when to get on his face. And so should we. You want to be a friend of God? He's got to be God. And the point is well taken. If the Lord's in the audience, we really find out what we're all about. Which is, I think, one of the reasons why I always, unless you can't make it, I always think it's good if you get here on time for worship. It's valuable. Worship brings you to the place where you realize who you're before and who you are. And I can't help but believe that worship always leaves you humble. Always. Right? It always leaves you like, "Oh, Lord, you're amazing." It recognizes who God is. Isaiah in chapter 6, it says when the king Uzziah died, he saw the Lord high and lifted up. Now, Isaiah was a believer and a prophet before then, but this understanding where the king, who he so admired and looked up to, was removed, and all he had a vision for now was the Lord behind the scenes. And it changed him. He started saying, even in chapter 6 there, "Woe is me, I'm undone. I'm from a people of unclean lips, and I dwell amongst the people that are like that as well. But my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of Lords." And it was then the Lord who touched him and cleansed him and prepared him for that position. But it humbled him. It's woe is me, not wow is me. Right? Whatever Isaiah thought about himself that day, God cleared up, and he never saw himself like that again. So Abram sees him coming, humbles himself, hits the deck, and he says in verse 3, "My Lord." But notice this Lord is a large L and a small O-R-D. It is the word Adonai. "The Lord, my Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant." Adonai. You are the Lord, I am not. And I think I've told you before, Adonai is really a recognition of authority. It literally says, you're up here and I'm down here. You're in charge and I'm not. You're the boss and I'm not the boss, applesauce. That thing. So it just recognizes God's authority. You're the Lord. Whatever you want to do, whatever you want to say. And so Abram acknowledges the Lord. We then read in verse 4, and here's the third point, or the third ingredient to being a friend of God. You have to have a ministry-minded heart that loves to serve him. I didn't say serve everybody else. I said serve the Lord. You've got to have a heart that wants to serve the Lord. Look what we read of Abraham. "Please let a little water be brought. You can wash your feet and rest yourself under the tree here, and I will bring you a morsel of bread that you might refresh your hearts, and after that you may pass on as much as you have come to your servant." And they said, "Do as you said. And so Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, quickly, make 3 measures of fine meal, knead them, and make some cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a tender and good calf, and he gave it to one of the young men. He hastened to prepare it. He took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate. You want to be and have a heart of service. Someone who is a friend of God is wrapped into serving the Lord out of love, out of gratefulness, out of an awareness of who he is. I want you to notice that Abraham's service here was personal. It's the heat of the day. He's 99 years old. He has 318 servants, at least that many to call upon. He could have clapped his hands and got the ball rolling. Instead, he runs her everywhere to try to be sure that the Lord is fed, that he's ministered to. This is his Adonai. This is his Lord. I want him to have all that he needs to have. And so serving him is much easier than serving people, because sheep bite back. But the Lord is gracious. So as long as you can do it for the Lord, then no sheep can turn your heart from serving God. If you read about the Old Testament priests, you will read that they aided in the sacrifice of the people, but they ministered to the Lord. And I think if you keep your eyes on people, and are they grateful enough? Did they acknowledge my goodness? Did they thank me for going out of my way? No. Doesn't matter. You're doing it for the Lord, you can never be discouraged. And Abram just runs around here. And notice how immediate his service was. Note in the text, in verse 6, the word hurried. Told Sarah to quickly make some bread. He ran to the herd. Told a young man to hasten to prepare. Generous in what he brought. He brought out the best. He was hospitable and welcoming. Fine meal, tender and good calf, butter and milk as well. If you have friends, you serve them your best. Give them your best. And to the Lord, your best effort, your best offering, your best time, your best energy. What the Lord doesn't need from a friend is leftovers. Sometimes at the thrift store, we will get what people don't want anymore. And I think they're convinced the Lord does want it. And I should just tell you that he doesn't want it either. If it's broken and not painted and clean and useful for someone, it isn't a place to dump your stuff. It's a place to serve the Lord. And so we want to bring him our best, right? We don't need broken, dirty, unwanted, and uncared for things that have been beat up and spit out and seen their better days. But we should be giving our best. When David made the mistake of numbering the people and all to see how his strength might be, and the Lord brought the plague upon everyone as a result of David's sin, David began to cry out, Lord, please stop. And the Lord directed him to go and get a field from a man named Aranu, and to build an altar there upon that land. And so David went to offer to buy it, and the fellow said, well, just take it. We don't want to die. End this plague now. And David said, I can't take it for free. I can't give God what doesn't cost me anything. And so he paid full price. We're going to see in a couple of weeks that Abraham pays way more than full price for a burial ground for his family. So it's just a matter of we want to give God our best. So Abram graciously gives to the Lord, who has given to him graciously. As if you're a Bible student, and maybe you've run into this before, but I'd like to point it out to you, and it's really not part of the lesson tonight, but as the two angels in the Lord eat, they eat milk with meat, which is a non-kosher meal according to the Jewish interpretation of Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 21, where we are told in the law that we shouldn't boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Now that would happen very unlikely, but in Israel, if you go today, they have kosher and non-kosher places to eat. If you get ice cream and a hamburger, you really can't sit in the same spot, So you won't be served milk with meat, because that might mix in your stomach, and in the odd event that it's the goat milk with the mother as well, or the child. And so this thing's gotten completely blown out of proportion, but at least in the Bible, the Lord didn't seem to have any problems eating like this. That was an aside, but there it is. That's a free one. Just write that one down. Verse 9. So then they said to him, "Where's Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "Well, she's here in the tent." And he said, "I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." Well, Sarah was listening in the tent door. She was eavesdropping, which was behind him. 13 years earlier, it had been Sarah suggesting that Hagar and Abraham should have a child so that the promise of God might be fulfilled. And last week, the Lord had specifically told Abraham, or 2 weeks ago, that the heir of promise would come through Sarah as well. Chapter 17, verse 16, 19, and verse 21. I think it's mentioned 3 times in there. And so Abraham had laughed. But the Lord didn't really rebuke Abraham's laugh, because it was a laugh of not unbelief, because we had just been told he believed God, but a laugh of joy. Oh, man, I can't believe it. It didn't seem to be a problem for him, because the Lord was able to do what the Lord had said. But here after supper, the Lord asks where Sarah is, not because he didn't know, but because he did know that she was listening at the tent door and behind the flaps anyway. And so the Lord begins to make this promise again of a child to come. Now, remember, she is 90 years old. So now Abram and Sarah were old. They were well advanced in years and age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore, Sarah laughed, but notice, within herself. Didn't laugh out loud, just inside. "After I have grown old, shall I have the pleasure, my Lord being old also?" And the Lord said to Abram, "Why did your wife laugh? Saying, surely shall I surely bear a child since I am old?" And then he said, "Is there anything really too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son." And then Sarah spoke up and she said, "I didn't laugh." She was afraid. And the Lord said, "No, you laughed." So he reiterates the promise he had made to Abraham, and he uses those familiar words, "I will." And you can find that repeated time and time again. And Sarah, hearing it, takes into account her old age. She laughs within herself, kind of a quiet laugh of unbelief. Who does this guy think he is? And who does he think he's kidding? Me and Abraham, we're too old as it is. But wouldn't you, if you were in her shoes, just looking at it from outside in, wouldn't this stop you in your tracks if this fella outside started talking about a baby and a child? You've just been promised that just a while back. How did he know what's going on? Who is this man at the door? The next words out of the Lord's mouth must have startled her back to reality about who was sitting with her husband, because he said, "Why are you laughing?" And only she knew. And she said, "I didn't laugh." "Oh, yes, you laughed." "How did he know?" "I was hiding behind the flap." And then the question in verse 14, is there anything too hard for the Lord? Awesome question, right? For in answering it, you reveal what your concept of God really is. Most of the time, when we run into doubt, it is simply because somehow we are limited in seeing how God might work. And that was her problem as well. I am 90, he's 100. I don't think that's going to work. She looked at the situation and declared it can't be done. It almost reduces itself, faith sometimes in its challenge, to where we could say, if I can see how it could be done, God can do it. But if I don't see how he might work, then I begin to have doubts. So I can pray for you if you have a headache, because if it doesn't work, you can take some aspirin. But if you have cancer and told you have 2 weeks to live, so suddenly I can't help you with that. And now I have to believe God or determine that I don't think God can help either. And then I'm left with that tremendous sense of doubt. Or they'll say, well, the doctor said, and I want to say, well, what does Jesus say? What does Dr. Jesus have to say? Why did Sarah laugh? And why did she then deny it? Because like us, her view is about capability, and she didn't see capability either in herself or in her husband. And so she laughed because she just saw it as overwhelming. This is no way that it can work out. Like I said in the last chapter, Abraham laughed, but it was a laughter of joy and disbelief, disbelief rather than unbelief, if that makes any sense, right? It was overwhelming to him. as it was. When Paul prayed for the Ephesians in his letter to them, he said, "Now unto him who is able to do beyond what you can ask or think." You should really begin to think about the God you serve like that. He can do stuff I can't even begin to imagine. In fact, if you can begin to imagine it, we haven't even started to talk about what God can do, because that's still your ability to imagine. But then the rest of that verse says, according to the power that works in us. God can do far more than we can ask or think. We would do well, I think, to carry this verse around with us for a while, this verse 14. You should go read it often, commit it to memory. Is there anything too hard for the Lord? Because it will help you continue to grow. And again, he adds the words, verse 14, I will. Which brings us to our fourth and final consideration of being a friend of God. We have to submit in faith to do his will and to walk in it. If you're really going to be God's friend, then you take him at his word and follow him implicitly. Jesus will say in John 15, greater love has no man that he would lay down his life for his friends. You're my friends. Oh, there it is. No one else is called that. You're my friends if you do whatever I command you. And I'm not calling you servants any longer, because a servant doesn't know what his master is doing. I'm calling you my friends, because everything that you've heard from my Father, I've heard from my Father, I'm going to make known to you. You're on the inside. You're in the in crowd. You've been brought in. You're God's friend. If you do what he asks of you to do. You want to be God's friend? Then commit to his word and allow that word to determine how you live. Let him be the Lord of your church and the Lord of your home and the Lord in your school and your Lord at work and your Lord in your relationship life. As a friend of Abraham, God saw in his commitment a demonstration of that, and he would like to find it in your life as well. Now, that literally ends verse 15, the declaration of the fruits of Abraham's life, at least in this chapter. And we are now turned in verse 16 and all the way through chapter 19, really, to the consequences and the certain judgment, both of Sodom and Gomorrah, but also of the consequences in Lot's life. And we'll finish this chapter tonight and pick up chapter 19 next week. In fact, you can read in verse 1 of chapter 19 that Lot is now a big shot in town, sitting in the gate. So verse 16, then the men, notice I said men there. Well, like I said in chapter 19, we'll read about the angels arriving. But in the men there, then the men rose from there, and they looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them on their way. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm doing? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all of the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have known him in order that he might command his children and his household after him, that they might keep the ways of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. And so, as the angels and the Lord rise to leave and head toward Sodom, Abraham goes to send them on their way, and these two angels will go ahead, but the Lord will hang behind. And notice in verse 17, 18, and 19, the Lord contemplates. We get the Lord's thoughts, if you will. He says them for our benefit. Should I not reveal myself to Abram, since he has come to know me and does know me, so that he might teach his children to walk with me, and he might pass on what I have given to him as they inherit his promises. And you get the understanding from the Lord that the Lord wants to make his ways known to his people. Shall I hide this from Abram, what is coming next? He must know me in my heart and judgment better, so that then I can continue to use him. So I can't just leave now and not let him in on what's going on. That's really what the Lord said. His contemplation says to us, he wants to reveal himself to us as his people, and that he wants you to know him better, so that that work of God can carry on from generation, if you will, to generation. The charge to raise your children in the ways of the Lord is the responsibility of parents. It's not your school's job. It's not our Sunday school teachers who at best can supplement the work that hopefully as godly parents that you're doing. But Abram will bless the world by blessing his family. It's almost like trickle-down evangelism, right? Your kids catch it from their parents, and then they pass it along, and you are best equipped when, like Abraham, you're God's friend, and you're doing exactly what he wants. So the Lord wants to tell Abram why he's here and where he's going and what he's planning to do. So he says in verse 20 to him, "Behold, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, because their sin is very grave. I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I'll know." And the men turned away from there and headed toward Sodom, but Abraham stood still before, and here's the word, Jehovah. Again, this is for sure an appearance of the Lord himself. So the Lord discloses to Abraham why he had come, where he is heading. The sins of Sodom had reached heaven's ears. And somehow, like the blood of Abel years earlier, God's righteousness is moved to act. Maybe in Sodom, Lot was praying. Maybe he had had enough. Though he and himself had not moved out of Sodom, maybe he was crying out to God to move in and do something about it. We do know in 2 Peter, this is what Peter wrote, and how God delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked, for that righteous man dwelling among them tortured his righteous soul from day to day, seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. It's all I know. But it could very well be that Lot himself was crying out, "Dear Lord, when are you going to move here?" One other important note for us is found, I think, in verse 21. And I think I mentioned it maybe Sunday or a couple of weeks ago. But we read there that the Lord wanted to know what the actual story was before he brought judgment. Now, I'll grant you the argument you're going to make immediately. Well, doesn't the Lord know it? Of course he does. But I think God would want you to know, and I to know, that God doesn't judge arbitrarily. He doesn't judge without any information or with partial information. He knows all of the facts. His judgment is righteous because he absolutely knows everything. Your intentions, your motives, what drove you, what really happened, the stories that you can hear. He knows it all. And he acts based upon full knowledge. So with the two angels with the Lord headed for the area of Sodom, and the Lord staying behind to speak further with Abram and to reveal to Abram his graciousness and his love, he starts off by saying, "I've come to see if what I'm hearing is so. I've come to verify the sin that is cried out that is so evil." And the sin was much more than sexual perversion. We'll look at it in a couple of weeks. Jeremiah said it was also laziness and too much time on their hands. There's a lot of things going on in Sodom. But needless to say, I love the fact that in verse 21, the Lord said, I'm coming to give it a thorough looking at so that the judgment will be without question. And you can count on that from the Lord. The Lord will judge you righteously. He knows everything. And it's good to know that, especially when you're feeling like you're being taken advantage of and no one seems to understand. Oh, he knows. He always knows. Verse 23, Abraham then came near to him and said, "Would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose that there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? For far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" A couple of things. He recognizes who he's talking to. But we see Abraham seeking to know the heart of God in judgment, especially since his nephew Lot is a resident and a leader of a city that the Lord has now marked for possible judgment. So Abraham humbly asks about God's judgment, and in so doing, at least in the first couple of verses, he answers his own question, right? He says, I know that God is fair and just, and he'd never destroy the righteous with the wicked, because he makes a distinction between the two. It is certainly the best argument for those who would be post-tribbers, who believe that somehow the church will go through the tribulation. We will not. And here's why. The tribulation comes from the throne of God. And you've been delivered from God's wrath in his Son. So you'll be delivered. You'll be gone. But Abraham here recognizes the Lord as the judge of all the earth. And so he said, what if there are 50 righteous people in town? Is Lot going to be okay? But like I said, he answers his own question. Verse 26, the Lord answers, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, I will spare all of the place for their sakes. Then Abraham answered and said, indeed, now I, who am but dust and ashes, humble, have taken upon myself to speak to Adonai. Suppose there were 5 less than 50 righteous. Would you destroy all of the place for the lack of 5? And so the Lord said, if I find there 45, I will not destroy it. And he spoke to him yet again and said, suppose, I'm going to get in trouble, I keep asking, should there be 40 only? And he said, I will not do it for the sake of 40. So Abraham is very humble. He knows whom he is speaking to. He realizes the place that he is in, talking with God about his righteous judgment, seeking to understand it. He goes down to 45. I'll leave it stand for the 45. I'll leave it stand for the 40. Verse 30. And then he said, let not the Lord Adonai be angry with me, and I will speak. Suppose there's 30. The Lord said, I will not do it if I can find 30 there. And then he said, indeed, now I have taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose there's 20. He said, I won't destroy for 20. And he said, let not my Lord be angry with me. I'll just do one more. Suppose there are 10. And he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. So Abraham is treading very lightly. He doesn't want to question God, but he wants to understand the Lord. And those kind of questions God is not upset with us for. So he goes from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30 to 20 to 10. And every time the wonderful words from the Lord, even for those few, I would spare destruction of the entire city. Now I want you to think about that for a minute. Because you and I are God's people. And yet you live in a world that is filled with God haters. But just think of how much blessing you've brought upon the unbelievers around you because you're here. That the wrath of God, the judgment of God is being restrained because you're here. You're really the blessing to the world. I know the world doesn't see you as that. You're them crazy right-wing, Christians. But at the rapture, when God takes us out of the way, God's judgment will proceed with a vengeance because you are then removed. But for just a few at your job, just a few believers, maybe you're the only one. And God has been so good to that business because you're involved. Daniel was certainly a man like that who the king saw as a believer, and he said, he's so blessed my country because of your presence. Now, the obvious thing is, because we've read the book, Sodom did not contain even 10 righteous people because the Lord destroyed it. And there would be few that would be removed from the Lord before judgment came. Even that few God spared. So as Abraham prays to God about insight and wisdom, notice that the heart of God hasn't changed. He is merciful, he's gracious, he's slow to anger, he checks things out, he knows things well. But the understanding of Abraham regarding the mercy and the grace of God have tremendously grown. Which is why I think you're in church, right? You go to church and you get your Bible out because as you get to know the Lord better, the beauty of fellowship with God changes you. You're conformed to his will. And you get to see life through his eyes. And that judgment that you learn begins to color your life. And your judgments become right. In his heart, Abraham is praying hard, for his nephew Lot, who along with his family are now so intricately woven into the fabric of this very wicked and doomed city. In fact, some of Lot's own family will be lost to the judgment of God when the judgment falls. Well, we'll conclude tonight with chapter 19, verse 1, where we read now the two angels. Remember, we just read in verse 16 that when the men rose, well, now we read when the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom, and when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them. He bowed himself with his face towards the ground. We've seen Abraham, a friend of God in fellowship with God. Next week, the consequences of living on the fringes. And like I said, I believe sincerely the Bible says Lot made it. But you can get in by the skin of your teeth and have a life that is really not much different than the world. Not much joy, not much peace, not much hope, not much fruitfulness. And God, still in his graciousness, delivers as he did Lot. But you have a choice to make. Either because you follow Lot's path, you make it, but boy, barely. Or you live the fruitful kind of life as Abraham. And the question is it really easy? Are you God's friend? Are you doing what he said? Are you available when he knocks unexpectedly? Are you willing to humble yourself and serve him even when others don't seem to be very thankful? Are you, is your relationship with him personal? Is your service to him immediate? Are you willing to give him generously of your time? Are you embracing his promises? Are you letting him be the Lord? Then he can be your friend. You can have a great life as a friend of God in a weird world. Or you can end up like Lot. It all depends upon the decisions you make about him. So read ahead. I'm sure we'll do chapter 19 next week. I don't know how much further we'll get, but that'll get you started. Father, thank you tonight for your word to us, and it is good to know that Abraham was your friend. He certainly wasn't always doing the right thing. He swung and missed quite often, struck out a few times, was put in his place by unbelievers and by your spirit and even family around him, and yet in the overall picture, he was pressing forward, and God, you were patient with him, and you continued to meet with him. And now we read at 99 years old, he meets with you face to face. And we get to see the fruit of his life and the fruit of his nephew's life, who had been making such terrible decisions for years, at least the last, almost 30 years, and now finds himself knee-deep in a city about to be destroyed. Lord, we'd rather be your friend than your enemy. And we certainly would rather be a friend of God, even in the way that you define it in your word, than Lot having a kind of arm's length relationship with you where the world had so much appeal, and was it not but for your grace, he'd have never survived. But you're a God who is so infinitely patient and in love with us, and you take care of your own, even if your own aren't really excelling very well in their walks with you. I hope that you're God's friend tonight, that you have time for him, that you're humble before him, that you're willing to let him be the Lord who can change your plans if that's what he wants to do, that you would serve the Lord with a readiness and a willingness with great desire, and that your service to the Lord would be personal, a heart for ministering to him. Certainly. And that you would do what he says. You'd obey his ways. Being God's friend, oh my goodness. He being our friend is phenomenal. Seems to me being a friend to God is to my benefit. But that he would want to be my friend. Wow. Live your life like Abraham. Ups and downs, swinging and missing, not always doing the right thing, but always heading forward, leaning into the things of God. Because by the time we get to the end of Abraham's life here in 5 or 6 chapters, we'll look back and say, man, we want to be like Abraham. Especially living in this dark time and being a light that God would like to use. You need prayer tonight. Pastors will be here. If you're watching online, you can follow the links below in the description box, and you can follow it to our web pages, and there'll be there, verses there to just encourage you tonight about your walk with God. But don't waste your life. Lot wasted his life. Not much good. Can you imagine your whole life depending on one verse? one verse that is found 2,000 years, 3,000 years, 4,000 years down the road. God help us. Be his friend tonight.